Out where the wind never rests, a man learns that love can, even after loss. The wind never stopped in Coyote Bend. It came rolling off the plains like a restless spirit, whispering through the dry grass, rattling loose shingles, and sighing over the lonely graves on the hill. Jed Callahan rode through it at dusk, hat brim low, coat collar turned up, his eyes fixed on the horizon that glowed like dying embers. The mare beneath him snorted and tossed her head as if sensing the weight he carried, grief that had long since hardened into silence. Behind him stretched miles of weathered fence and brittle pasture. Ahead, the faint outline of his ranch, Callahan homestead, waited under a bleeding sky. As Jed crested the last rise, his gaze drifted to the small white cross at the edge of the ridge. The grave of his wife, May, stood there, lonely against the wind. He reined in his horse, tipping his hat in silent greeting. "Evenin', May," he murmured. His voice, gravelly from years of dust and sorrow, broke the silence like a prayer. Below the ridge, lamplight flickered through the windows of the house. Inside waited Clara, his daughter, barely 10, small and pale as a moth. She struggled with her letters, though Jed had tried his best to teach her after the schoolteacher left town last winter. The child's eyes would cloud, her lip tremble, and Jed's patience, gentle but clumsy, could only go so far. That night, after supper of beans and cornbread, Clara asked softly, "Pa, when's the new teacher comin'?" Jed folded his hands on the table. "Tomorrow, sweetheart. Miss Boone's riding in from Abilene." Clara's smile was faint, hesitant, like she wasn't sure happiness was allowed in that house anymore. When morning broke, the sky was as pale as bone. Jed saddled the mare again and rode into town, the air sharp with dust and gossip. Coyote Bend was a place where every whisper carried. A man couldn't lose a fence post without half the town knowing. At the edge of the main street, near the small clapboard schoolhouse, stood Lila Boone, new to the frontier, 20-something, with sun-browned cheeks and eyes too curious for her own good. She wore a plain dress, dusted from travel, and clutched a satchel of books like armor. Jed dismounted, offering a nod. "Miss Boone, Jed Callahan." She straightened, her smile polite but guarded. "Mr. Callahan, I've heard your name. Folks say you've got the largest spread this side of the creek." "Used to," he replied. "Weather's been harder than most years." Their handshake was brief but steady, hers firm, his calloused. As they talked, eyes from the general store and saloon lingered. Mrs. Tanner whispered to her friend near the well, "He's bringing her out to his ranch? Alone?" Lila felt the weight of those stares but ignored them. "You mentioned your daughter's reading troubles in your letter," she said. "I'll be glad to help," Jed nodded. "Clara's bright, just needs someone patient." He didn't add someone who ain't haunted by ghosts. By afternoon, the two rode toward the Callahan place. Lila on a borrowed mare, Jed riding beside her in steady silence. The plains stretched endlessly, the sky a hard blue bowl above them. As they neared the ranch, Lila spoke softly. "It's quiet out here." Jed glanced her way. "You get used to the quiet. Sometimes it's the only thing that doesn't judge you." That evening, Clara greeted her shyly. Lila knelt to meet the girl's gaze. "We'll take our time. No rush." The first lesson was halting, awkward. But when Clara finally sounded out a word, home, Jed's heart stirred for the first time in years. As the sun fell, he watched Lila help his daughter, the lamplight softening her features. For a fleeting moment, the emptiness of the house seemed less cruel. Outside, wind whispered through the fences and into the night, carrying with it the faintest question: can a man who's lost everything ever find warmth again? The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Each morning, dust rose from the Callahan Ranch Road as Lila Boone arrived, satchel of books at her side, determination in her eyes. The gossip that trailed her like a shadow only thickened with each visit. At the general store, tongues wagged between the sugar barrels and flour sacks. A young woman out there alone with a widower? Mrs. Tanner clucked. Ain't proper. Old man Duffy, leaning on his cane, spat into the dirt. Jed Callahan's a good man. Town just can't stand to see decency without a rumor hanging off it. Still, words traveled faster than stagecoaches in Coyote Bend. Out at the ranch, life moved more slowly. The creak of the windmill, the clatter of hooves in the corral, the soft voice of a teacher guiding a hesitant child. Lila would kneel beside Clara, tracing letters in the dirt with a stick. T, she'd say, smiling when Clara repeated them right. Jed often stood in the doorway watching in silence. Lila's patience drew something out of his daughter he hadn't seen since May passed, a spark of confidence. For that alone he was grateful. One afternoon, Lila stayed later than usual. The sky had turned from gold to gray and the wind shifted, the kind of wind that whispered trouble. Jed looked up from the barn. Storm comin', he muttered. Best you stay the night, Miss Boone. That trail's a river in the dark when it rains. Lila hesitated. I wouldn't want to impose. You'd be safer here than halfway to town, he said simply. By sundown, the storm rolled in heavy and mean. Rain hammered the roof, thunder cracked across the plains, and lightning lit the sky in white veins. Inside, Clara slept soundly by the hearth while Jed poured coffee into 2 tin mugs. Lila sat at the table, trying not to flinch at the thunder. Back east, she said softly, storms meant company. Folks would gather round and tell stories till it passed. Jed nodded, eyes distant. Out here, storms take more than they give. For a long moment, only the rain spoke. Then, quieter, Lila asked, Was it long ago? Your wife? Jed's jaw tightened. 3 winters now. Fever took her. Lila lowered her gaze. I'm sorry. She was the heart of this place. When she went, the house turned hollow. Lightning flashed again, and Lila saw him clearly, the deep lines of loss etched in his face, the steadiness of a man who'd carried grief like a yoke and never complained. Clara stirred in her sleep, mumbling. Jed rose, knelt beside her, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek with a gentleness that caught Lila off guard. She'd known men to be strong, stubborn, proud, but tenderness like that? It was rarer than rain in summer. As he tucked the blanket around his daughter, Lila felt something shift inside her. The way she'd seen him, rough, distant, older, blurred into something else. Something human. Later, as the fire dimmed, Jed poured another mug and offered it. For the cold. Lila accepted, their fingers brushing. A quiet spark passed between them, unexpected, unspoken. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, rattling the shutters like a warning and a promise both. When morning came, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving puddles that caught the sunrise. Lila stood on the porch, hair loose, watching the light spread over the wet fields. Jed joined her, hat in hand. You'll catch more talk staying here last night? She smiled faintly. Let them talk. He looked at her then, not as a hired teacher, not as a town outsider, but as a woman brave enough to face storms of more than just weather. And though neither spoke it aloud, something unspoken began between them that morning. A thread of quiet understanding woven through rain and rumor alike. The weeks that followed carried a slow change through the Callahan ranch. Spring thawed the frost from the hills, and with it the silence between Jed and Lila began to soften. Each morning she arrived with her satchel, her voice bright against the wind, her laughter echoing across the yard as Clara read aloud from the primer. Stumbling but determined, Jed worked nearby, mending a fence or shoeing a horse, yet his ears always caught every sound from that porch, the rustle of pages, Clara's giggles, Lila's quiet encouragement. There was life again at the Callahan place, small and steady, like a fire built from the last embers of winter. One afternoon, a section of the barn roof tore loose after a strong wind. Without a second thought, Lila climbed the ladder beside Jed, her skirts tied at the knee, hammer in hand. He looked up at her, startled. "Ain't work for a schoolteacher," she grinned, sweat streaking her temple. "Then today, I'm just a woman who doesn't like seeing a roof half done." They worked side by side under the sharp sun, nailing planks and laughing when the wind nearly stole her hat. When the job was done, she sat on the ridge beam, legs dangling, looking out at the endless prairie. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "All this space. It feels like it could swallow you whole or set you free." Jed's gaze followed hers. "Sometimes it does both." Below, Clara ran through the tall grass, arms outstretched, her laughter bright as bird song. For a moment everything felt right, not perfect, but peaceful. That evening, as they shared supper, Lila asked about the cattle, about the dry spell, about how a man kept going when the land seemed determined to break him. Jed answered quietly, not with pride, but truth. "You keep fixin' what breaks. Sometimes that's fences. Sometimes that's yourself." Lila nodded, eyes lowered. "And if you can't fix it, then you wait," he said, "and you endure." It wasn't just words, it was how he lived. Yet beyond the ranch, the town's patience thinned. In the pews of the small white church, whispers flickered like candlelight. Parents pulled their children closer. Women avoided Lila's gaze in the mercantile. Even the preacher's wife gave a pointed smile that cut deeper than scorn. "She's keeping company with that widower," they said. "What's decent about that?" Lila heard it all but held her chin high. The truth was simpler than their rumors. She loved teaching. She loved Clara's progress, and against her better judgment, she was beginning to care for the man behind the stoic eyes and weathered hands. Still, the weight of gossip pressed heavily. One morning she lingered before knocking on Jed's door, staring at her reflection in the window pane. The woman she saw there, sunburned, dusty, unafraid, wasn't the same schoolteacher who'd ridden into town weeks ago. Later that day, Clara burst through the kitchen door, waving a book. "I finished it, Pa. Every word." Jed lifted her high, laughing, the rare sound filling the house like music. Lila watched, warmth swelling in her chest. He turned to her, smiling, genuine, unguarded. "Couldn't have done it without you, Miss Boone." "Lila," she corrected softly. Their eyes met, steady, unflinching. Something deep and dangerous stirred between them, a feeling that neither dared name. That night, as the wind cooled and the lamp burned low, Lila sat on the porch, watching stars bloom over the plains. Jed joined her, coffee steaming in his hands. "Town's been talking again," he said after a pause. "Let them," she murmured. "They'll tire of it eventually." Maybe, he said, looking out into the dark. But folks don't often let go of what they don't understand. Their silence afterward wasn't empty. It was charged, fragile, and full of everything they couldn't yet say. Out there, beneath the endless western sky, two souls, one hardened by loss, one bound by duty, found themselves standing on the quiet edge of something neither expected, the beginning of belonging. The wind changed again in Coyote Bend, this time carrying trouble. It came with the smell of smoke from distant pastures and the sound of hooves that didn't belong. The name whispered across fence lines and saloon counters was Rex Lohman, a cattle baron with money, muscle, and a smile that never reached his eyes. Lohman rode into town with a polished grin and a pocket full of papers. Deeds, he claimed, proving that a stretch of Callahan land belonged to him. Nobody believed him at first. Then came the men, armed, confident, and unafraid to make a point. Jed met Lohman on the edge of his north pasture, where the grass grew thin and the wind spoke of conflict. The rancher's hands were steady, his eyes cold. "This land's been Callahan ground since my father staked it," Jed said, voice low. Lohman's smirk never faltered. "Paper says otherwise. You can fight the ink if you like, but the marshal only reads what's written." Jed said nothing, but the set of his jaw was answer enough. Word spread fast. By nightfall, Lila herded at the schoolhouse. She saddled her borrowed mare and rode straight for the ranch. The sky bled red as the sun dropped, and the prairie wind carried a taste of dust and anger. She found Jed in the barn, sharpening a post-hole digger, his expression unreadable. "They say Lohman's taking your grazing land," she said. "Trying to," he answered. "And you'll fight him?" He looked up, meeting her gaze. "This land's all that's left of her. Every inch she planted, every fence she painted, it's maize. I won't sell and I won't be run off." Lila's voice trembled with the storm inside her. "Jed, you can start again somewhere else. You and Clara, there are places." He shook his head slowly. "You can't start again when you've still got Ghost holding the gate." The lantern between them flickered, throwing their shadows long across the hay-strewn floor. Lila stepped closer. "You'd risk everything for a memory?" He looked at her then, really looked, past the school teacher's composure, past the judgment she hid behind. "Not for a memory," he said softly. "For the promise I made to her. And maybe for the chance to keep living right." The silence that followed was heavy as thunder. Lila's throat tightened. "You're as stubborn as the land itself." "Maybe," he said. "But it's the only way I know to stay alive." She wanted to argue, to tell him how foolish it was, how pride and grief would crush him. But the words died when she saw the ache in his eyes. It wasn't pride. It was love, the kind that never left even when the person did. Lila turned away, her hands trembling. "You think I don't understand loss? I left someone once, someone I thought I'd marry. He didn't wait. Choose someone else before the season turns. Since then I've kept to the rules, to distance. Easier that way." Jed stepped forward, his voice soft but unyielding. "You can't lose what you never let yourself have." The words hung between them, raw and simple. Lila's breath caught. For the first time since arriving in Coyote Bend, she felt completely seen, and it terrified her. The lantern light swayed. Outside wind rattled the barn doors like impatient hands. Jed reached for his hat, breaking the moment. "Best get you home before dark." She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, before folks talk more than they already do." but as she mounted her mare she looked back once. Jed stood by the barn door outlined by lantern glow, a solitary figure bound to the land like a rooted oak. Riding away, Lila felt the ache of something fragile breaking open inside her. An understanding too deep for words and too dangerous for the life she'd built. For the first time, she feared not the gossip or the distance between them, but what might happen if she never bridged it. The summer heat bore down on Coyote Bend dry and merciless. Grass withered, tempers flared, and the feud between Jed Callahan and Rex Lohman grew like wildfire, waiting for a spark. That spark came one night when the sky hung low and orange. A shout from the bunkhouse broke the silence, then the smell of smoke. Jed burst from his bed, boots half pulled on, shotgun in hand. Out across the pasture, flames licked the horizon. His north field was burning. He rode hard through the night, wind full of ash and embers. By the time he reached the fence line, it was too late. The fire had eaten half his grazing land. The air choked with smoke. Lohman's riders watched from the ridge, their silhouettes black against the inferno. Jed leveled the shotgun, but they turned their horses and vanished into the night. By dawn, word of the blaze had reached town. Folks gathered in clusters near the well, shaking their heads, muttering. "Reckless," someone said. "He's lost his mind, keeping up this fight." Lila heard it all from the schoolhouse steps. Her hands trembled around her books. By noon she was riding for the ranch again, heart-pounding, dust rising behind her like a storm. She found Jed standing where the field had been, now just blackened earth and smoking fence posts. His face was gray with exhaustion, his eyes hollow. Clara clung to his arms, silent. "Jed?" Lila's voice caught. "It was Lohman, wasn't it?" He didn't answer, just stared at the scorched ground. "Doesn't matter who lit it. Town'll say I started it myself. Always do." "They can't," she insisted. "They wouldn't," but she saw it in his eyes. They already had. Later that afternoon, as Jed led Clara to the creek to wash off the soot, Marshal Deacon rode up with 2 men in tow. His face was lined with regret. "Jed, folks are saying you're behind this," he said quietly. "Lohman's claiming you torched the pasture to fake sympathy." Jed laughed, a sound sharp and bitter. "You know better than that." "I do, but I can't stop people talking. And if there's another fire," Jed's gaze hardened, "there won't be." The marshal tipped his hat and left, dust swirling behind his horse. When the sun fell, Lila stayed behind, helping Clara pick through what little was saved. The girl's small hands shook as she gathered burnt books and half-charred toys. Lila knelt beside her, whispering comfort she barely believed. That night, Lila and Jed stood by the corral. The silence between them was no longer gentle, it was raw, bruised. "You can't fight everyone, Jed," she said finally. "You'll lose everything, your land, your name, your daughter." Jed looked at her with weary eyes. "What would you have me do, Lila? Let a liar take what's mine, crawl back to town and beg men who never lifted a hand for me?" She swallowed. "I'd have you live," he shook his head. "Living's easy. It's keeping what matters that costs." Lila felt the weight of all the words she wanted to say pressing against her chest. Instead, what came out was cold and defensive. Words meant to protect her heart, not speak it. "You're too old for me, Jed," she said quietly, "and too set in your ways." "I won't be part of this," he froze. The hurt didn't show on his face, but it settled deep in his eyes. "I see," he said simply. She turned before she could take it back. The wind caught her skirt as she mounted her mare. and she rode off into the dusk without looking behind. From the ridge, the burned pasture stretched black and endless below her. Smoke curled upward, twisting into the sky like regret made visible. At the ranch, Jed stood alone in the ruin, Clara asleep inside, the silence pressing heavy as the night. He looked once toward the road she'd taken, then to the grave on the hill. His voice was barely a whisper. "Guess it's just us again, May." The wind answered with nothing but the rustle of dead grass. For 3 days, the schoolhouse bell rang hollow without laughter. The bench by the window, Clara's bench, sat empty. Lila Boone stood before her class, voice steady but heartbreaking. She read aloud, though the words came out flat, lifeless. The children sensed it. Even they, small and innocent, had heard the whispers. The teacher's heart's gone Callahan's way, and she's paying for it. By dusk, Lila sat alone at her desk, papers spread before her, the lamplight trembling with the wind. She tried to write her resignation, to end what little peace she had left, but every line felt like betrayal. Her conscience wouldn't let the ink dry. That night, as thunder grumbled over the plains, she pulled out the school's property records. Loman's forged deeds had bothered her. Too clean, too new for something he claimed was decades old. She leafed through ledgers and archives until her fingers were black with dust. Then she found it. An old county map from before the war, drawn by hand, showing the Callahan boundary. Land granted to Jed's father under federal homestead rights. The coordinates matched perfectly, but Loman's document claimed a shifted line, a mile east, cutting straight through Callahan's grazing land. The forgery was clear as daylight. Lila's breath caught. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She sat back, staring at the paper that could clear Jed's name and destroy Loman's. But to bring it forward meant ruin for herself. The school trustees were financed by Loman's associates. The town already saw her as compromised, her reputation bruised by rumor. To challenge him would mean open defiance, risking her post, her home, her place in this world. Still, she thought of Clara's soft voice reading home, of Jed's silent strength in the face of loss. She thought of the fire in his eyes when he said, "You can't lose what you never let yourself have." For the first time, Lila understood what he meant. By morning, she had made her choice. She rode out before sunrise, the wind cold against her face, the papers tucked inside her coat. Dew clung to the grass, and the land stretched vast and gold around her. The Callahan ranch appeared in the distance, scarred, quiet, smoke-stained, but still standing. Jed was already in the yard, repairing the fence line alone. The sight of him, tired, stooped, resolute, hit her like a blow. He didn't look up as she approached. "Thought you'd be halfway back east by now," he said, hammering another nail. "I almost was," she said softly, dismounting. "But I found something." He turned, suspicion flickering in his eyes, then curiosity. She handed him the paper. "It's proof. Loman forged your deed. The original county map says the land's yours. I can take this to the marshal." Jed looked down at the document, then back at her. His voice was low. "You'd do that? After everything the town said?" "I'm done living afraid of them," she said. "You once told me a person can't lose what they never let themselves have." "Well, maybe I'm ready to lose something if it means doing what's right." For a long moment neither spoke. Only the wind moved through the blackened grass. Then Jed's expression softened, pride and sorrow blending into something unspoken. "Lila," he began, but she cut him off gently. No, don't thank me, not yet. If this goes wrong, I could lose my post, but I'd rather be honest and outcast than silent and safe. Jed took the paper, his rough fingers brushing hers. You're braver than you think, she smiled faintly. Maybe I learned from a rancher too stubborn to quit. As she turned to leave, he called after her, voice rough with emotion. You ride careful, Lila Boone. She paused, looking back. You too, Jed Callahan. And with that she rode toward town, the proof of his truth pressed to her heart. The wind rose behind her like applause or warning. For the first time, the fear that had defined her began to fade, replaced by something steadier. Conviction. The morning sun rose hard and bright over Coyote Bend, painting the dusty street in gold. By the time Lila Boone rode into town, folks were already gathering. Men leaning on hitching posts, women trading whispers near the mercantile porch. The air buzzed with rumor. She's going to the marshal. She's defending Callahan. Lila dismounted, every eye following her. Her boots clicked against the boardwalk as she made her way toward the marshal's office. The old map clutched tight in her hand. The saloon doors creaked open down the street. Rex Lohman stepped out, polished as ever, hat clean, boots shining, his smirk practiced. Well now, he drawled, tipping his hat. Miss Boone, heard you've taken a shine to lost causes. Lila met his gaze without flinching. Some causes deserve to be found. The crowd stiffened, sensing trouble. Marshal Deacon stepped out from his office, frowning. Lila, what's this about? She drew a deep breath, holding out the papers. Proof that Jed Callahan's land deed is valid. These are the original homestead records from the county archives. The boundaries never changed. Lohman's document, she turned, eyes flashing toward the cattle baron, was forged. A murmur ran through the crowd. Lohman's face didn't move, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. That's a mighty strong accusation, miss. You'd better have more than a schoolteacher's guess. I have the marshal's seal on the original, she said, lifting the paper higher, and the signatures of 2 witnesses from the claim registry. Your paper is dated 3 months after one of them passed away. Dead men don't sign deeds. The street fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Marshal Deacon took the papers, scanning them with care. His brows knit together. When he finally looked up, his voice was flat. She's right. These match the federal record. Jed Callahan's land stands. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Lohman's polished grin faltered. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're making a dangerous enemy, Miss Boone. You think one scrap of paper will protect you from how this town works? Lila didn't move. Maybe not, but truth will. The marshal's hand rested on his revolver. That's enough, Lohman. You'd best ride out before I find a reason to hold you. For a long, heavy moment, Lohman stared at Lila, cold, calculating. Then with a sneer he turned, spitting in the dust. You'll regret this, he hissed and strode toward his horse. When he rode off, the town slowly exhaled. Folks began whispering again, but the tone had changed. Not scandal, but shame. Lila stood alone in the street, heart pounding. She'd expected triumph, maybe relief, but all she felt was quiet exhaustion, and the faint tremor of fear that comes when you've done something you can't take back. The marshal touched his hat. You did right, Miss Boone. Reckon you saved Callahan's name. Lila nodded faintly. That's all I wanted. Before she could turn, the sound of hooves reached her ears. She looked up to see Jed Callahan riding in, his face drawn and dusted with road grit. He must have heard. He dismounted slowly, eyes scanning the crowd, then settling on her. No words passed between them for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Heard tell you went and faced the devil for me." Lila tried to smile, though tears burned behind her eyes. Someone had to remind the town what right looks like. Jed's jaw worked. "You didn't owe me this." "I know," she said. "But I couldn't watch good burn while evil stayed clean." The crowd began to disperse, pretending not to stare. Though every soul in Coyote Bend would remember this day, the teacher who defied a cattle baron and the rancher she'd fought for. Jed tipped his hat to her. "You're something else, Lila Boone." "And you," she replied softly, "deserve your land and your peace." For the first time in months, Jed smiled, not out of gratitude, but pride. They stood together in the street as the dust settled around them, the morning light spilling across their faces, and for once, the people of Coyote Bend had no gossip left, only quiet respect. The air in Coyote Bend changed after that day. The same townsfolk who once whispered behind gloved hands now tipped their hats when Lila Boone passed by. No one said much, but silence in a town like that was its own kind of apology. Rex Lohman had ridden out that morning under the marshal's watchful eye, his name trailing behind him like dust. The law would see to him in Abilene. Out on the Callahan ranch, smoke no longer rose from burned pastures, just the slow, steady rhythm of rebuilding. Jed worked dawn to dusk with the quiet endurance of a man who'd finally laid down a burden. New posts lined the fence rows and fresh seed furrowed the blackened earth. When Lila rode out one evening with supplies for Clara's lessons, the sun hung low, turning the hills to gold. Jed was by the creek washing soot from his hands, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The moment he saw her, the faintest smile touched his face. "Didn't figure I'd see you back so soon," he said, voice warm but careful. Lila dismounted, brushing dust from her skirt. "I couldn't stay away. Clara's reading is too fine to quit now." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You gave that girl more light than this whole ranch has seen in years." They fell into a quiet rhythm again, tending to chores side by side as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Every glance carried a new understanding. Every silence held something tender, unfinished. As dusk deepened, Clara ran to her father with a small bouquet of wildflowers, her smile shy. "Miss Lila says these mean hope." Jed took them carefully. "Hope's a fine thing to grow around here." Lila met his eyes over Clara's shoulder, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to still, the way the air hung after a storm when everything smells like earth and beginning. Later, after Clara was asleep, they sat on the porch, the lantern between them casting soft light. The land stretched dark and endless before them, cicadas singing in the grass. Jed leaned back, hat resting on his knee. "Town owes you more than thanks, Lila." "I didn't do it for the town." He looked at her, eyes searching. "Then why?" She hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Because you were right. I've lived too long afraid of gossip, of loss, of wanting something I might lose again. But when I saw your land burn, I realized fear doesn't keep you safe. It just keeps you alone." Jed was silent for a long while. Then he nodded slowly, his voice low and steady. "I never wanted you to choose me, Lila. I just wanted you to stop running from what's true." Her throat tightened. "And what's true, Jed Callahan?" He turned toward her, the lines on his face softening under the lamplight. "That age doesn't scare me. Losing doesn't scare me. But watching someone walk away 'cause they're afraid to feel, that scares me plenty. Lila looked down, tears glinting in her lashes. Maybe I was never afraid of your years. Maybe I was afraid of what they meant, of how sure you are, how steady. Jed's voice was barely a whisper. Then I'll grow old with you. She looked up, startled. But the smile on his face was gentle, certain. Not a plea, a promise. For a moment neither spoke. The night air seemed to hold its breath, wrapping around them like a blessing. Finally, Lila laughed softly through the tears. You make it sound easy. Jed's eyes warmed. Ain't easy. Just right. He reached out, and this time she didn't pull away. Her hand fit into his, small, sure, steady. In the distance, the first stars broke through the dark, their light trembling over the plains, and for the first time since the fire, since the loss, since the long, aching silence of grief, there was peace. Not the peace of endings, but the kind born from something new, fragile, and strong all at once, love unafraid. Spring came quietly to Coyote Bend. The plains, once scarred and blackened, now shimmered with soft green. Wildflowers spread where ashes had been, their colors bright, a symbol of forgiveness. The air smelled of rain and sage, and somewhere far off, the river hummed like a song half remembered. At the Callahan Ranch, life had retaken on a gentle rhythm. The mornings began with Clara's laughter echoing through the open yard, the sound mingling with the low calls of cattle and the creak of the windmill. Lila Boone stood on the porch, coffee cup in hand, her eyes sweeping over the land. It no longer looked lonely, it looked alive. She'd traded her schoolhouse desk for the ranch's wide-open classroom. Clara sat nearby with a book, her voice lilting and sure as she read aloud. And so the meadow grew again. She finished proudly. Jed stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. You're getting quicker every day, darling, he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. Clara grinned. Miss Lila says words are like seeds. You plant enough of them and they'll grow into stories. Jed chuckled. She's right about that. Lila looked at him over the rim of her cup, a playful smile tugging her lips. You doubted me once. He shrugged with a slow grin. Didn't doubt you, just didn't figure you'd plant so many. They shared a look, one of those simple, knowing glances that carried the weight of all they'd been through. The fear, the fire, the loss, and the choosing. By noon the sun was high, and the three of them rode out together to mend a fence line beyond the ridge. Lila's skirts were shorter now, more practical, her hands roughened by ranch work, but she wore it all like freedom. Jed rode beside her, his hat tilted low, his smile faint but constant. They worked without many words, but every sound, the ring of the hammer, the rustle of wind through the grass, the snort of horses felt like part of a hymn. At one point, Jed paused, leaning on the fence post. You ever think about leaving? He asked softly. Going back east where things ain't so rough? Lila squinted against the sunlight, considering. Used to. Thought there was more out there for me. But now I think. The world's not measured by how far it stretches, but by who you share it with. Jed nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. Reckon that's the truest thing I ever heard. A hawk circled high above, catching the thermals, its shadow sweeping across the earth. Lila watched it soar. Do you ever miss her? She asked quietly, meaning his late wife. Jed's gaze softened. Every day. But not the way I used to. Back then, the missing was like a hole I kept falling into. Now, it's more like a memory I carry so she can rest. Lila smiled faintly. She'd be proud of you, Of Clara. He looked at her then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude. Love. A quiet vow that didn't need words. They finished the fence before dusk. The sky turned red gold. The kind of light that made everything, dust, sweat, scars, look beautiful. Back at the ranch, Clara sat on the porch steps reading aloud from her book again, her small voice rising into the evening. The meadow was never the same again. It was better. Jed settled beside Lila, his arm brushing hers as the last of the sun bled across the plains. "You ever think we deserved all this?" he asked, half smiling. Lila leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. "I think we earned it." The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the scent of earth and rain. The ranch stood whole again. Fences mended, hearth rebuilt, hearts healed. And as the day slipped into night, the plains glowed under the fading light. Jed's hand found hers, rough and sure. Neither spoke. They didn't have to, because in that wide, quiet land, under a sky painted with the colors of old dreams, a promise was already kept, the promise that began with a smile and a vow whispered long ago, "Then I'll grow old with you." The year turned, as it always did, and Coyote Bend kept its slow, steady rhythm. The town's edges blurred into the plains, its dust mixing with memory, its sky wide enough to hold both sorrow and grace. Out beyond the ridge, the Callahan Ranch breathed with life again. The pasture where fire once roared now rolled green and full, dotted with grazing cattle and wildflowers. Windmills creaked lazily under a blue so wide it felt like forever. Jed Callahan stood by the gate at dawn, a mug of coffee warming his hands. His hair had more gray now and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but so had the peace behind them. The kind that comes not from winning or losing but from simply continuing. Behind him the porch door creaked open. Lila stepped out, shawl draped around her shoulders. Her hair was loose, the morning breeze tugging at it. She looked at him the way a traveler looks at a home finally found. "Morning," she said softly. Jed smiled without turning. "You always sneak up on me this time of day. Maybe I like the view from here." He finally turned, grinning. "I was thinking the same thing." They stood in companionable silence, watching the first light touch the hills. A new calf bawled in the distance, and Clara's laughter carried faintly from the barn where she was already tending to chores. Lila stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "You ever think how far we've come since that storm?" Jed nodded slowly. "Seems a lifetime ago." "Maybe it was," she smiled. "Do you ever miss the quiet? The kind you had before all this?" He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "That kind of quiet was just loneliness dressed up nice. This here, this is peace." Lila's eyes softened. "You always know the difference," Jed chuckled. "Took me half a lifetime to learn it." They walked down toward the pasture, the dew sparkling like glass under their boots. Clara came running up the trail, waving a paper in her hand. "Miss Lila, I finished my story," she shouted, breathless with pride. Lila knelt, taking the paper gently. "Let's hear it then." Clara began to read, her small voice full of wonder. "Once there was a ranch where everything burned, but the land remembered how to heal. And the people who stayed found that love grows like grass, slow but strong." Jed swallowed hard, his throat tightening as he looked at his daughter. "That's mighty fine, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough with feeling. Clara smiled up at them both. I think Mama would have liked it. Jed rested his hand gently on her shoulder. She would have loved it. They walked back together, the three of them framed against the rising sun. Father, daughter, teacher, family now in every way that mattered. By midday, the sky turned to silver heat, and the wind carried the scent of clover. Lila stood on the porch writing in her own small journal. The pages fluttered like wings. She looked up as Jed approached, his steps slow, measured. He carried a small box carved from mesquite wood. "What's this?" she asked. He set it down beside her and opened it. Inside lay 2 silver rings, simple, hand-forged, polished by time. "Didn't figure we needed words to make it official," he said quietly. "But I thought maybe we could call it a promise kept." Lila's breath caught. "You made these?" He nodded. "From the horseshoe I found after the fire. Thought it ought to mean something." She reached out, fingers trembling as she touched the cool metal. Then she looked up at him, eyes bright with the kind of love that doesn't burn fast. It endures. "Jed Callahan," she whispered, smiling through tears. "You sure do know how to make a woman believe in forever." He slipped the ring onto her hand, his voice low and steady. "Forever's just another word for every day I get to see you smile." The wind stirred, carrying their laughter out across the open range. As the sun dipped low that evening, the sky flared gold and crimson. The ranch lay quiet beneath it, whole and alive. Clara's voice floated through the air as she read to the horses, the sound mingling with the soft murmur of the land. Jed and Lila stood together by the fence, hands entwined, watching the world turn toward night. No words were needed, only the hush of wind through grass, the steady beat of 2 hearts that had weathered every storm. And as the last light slipped below the horizon, Jed smiled that same quiet smile he'd worn from the start, the one that carried both grief and grace. "Then I'll grow old with you," he murmured again, not as a promise this time, but as truth already lived. And under the endless sky of Coyote Bend, love held fast, stronger than loss, softer than time, and as eternal as the plains themselves. If you enjoyed this story from the Wild West, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell icon, so you never miss another tale of love, grit, and redemption from the frontier.